Okay, hello everybody, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your coffee and your ice cream. My name is Fiona Sweeney and I'm joined by my colleague Ciara McGarry Quinn, and we're going to facilitate our professional panel discussion. So first I'd like to say thank you to all our panellists for taking the time to join us here this morning for what I believe will be a very interesting, stimulating and I hope diverse discussion. So the plan for this session is to ask two key questions which were posed by our keynote Calwant. If time allows, there will be an opportunity to hear from our panellists of their own reflection of the keynote address this morning, and also to address what +1 change they'd like to see happening after today. So first of all, let me introduce you to our panel. So first of all, we have Maria Joyce. Maria is coordinator of the National Travellers Women Forum Ireland. She's been a human rights activist for many years, she tells me. And she is a graduate of Maynooth University with a BA in Applied Social Studies. The National Forum aims to raise awareness of the issues affecting traveller women and to work towards ensuring these issues are recognised and reflected in policy development. As coordinator, Maria plays a lead role in representing the issues raised through the forum with key stakeholders, government, departments and bodies. Maria was recently chairperson of the Path 3 College Connect Regional Steering Group. She was also on the advisory group that developed the Traveller and Roma Education Strategy, and she remains on that advisory group for the rollout of that strategy and also the NITRIS and the National Girls Strategy as well. Second, we have David Friel. David is an Irish traveller, lecturer in social care at Atlantic Technological University and adjunct lecturer at UCD. He teaches on the Traveller Ethnicity and Rights module. He is a Carew registered social care worker with extensive experience across diverse practice settings. David is currently completing his PhD on travellers' lived experience of racism during and following the COVID-19 pandemic. His work spans traveller equality, anti-racism, social justice and human rights, and focuses on challenging structural inequality through research, policy and practice. Next, we have David Joyce. David is coordinator of further and higher education at Pavee Point Traveller and Roma Centre, a national NGO based in Dublin, focused on Traveller and Roma community advocacy. He holds a BA in Sociology and History and a first-class professional Masters of Education. He's an experienced secondary school teacher. David is a leading member, was a leading member of the College Connect research team, which undertook the community needs analysis of Traveller and Roma students and their experience of higher education, which was published in 2024, I think. Is that right? He was 25. He was also a member of the research team for the Irish Traveller Access to Justice project conducted by University of Limerick, published in 2022. And David is a member of our Path 5 Traveller and Roma advisory group. Next, we have Deirdre McGillicuddy. And Deirdre is Associate Professor in Education in UCD School of Education and co-director of the newly established BEd in Education Gaeilge Agus and in Modern Language programme, which she conceptualised, designed, developed and implemented in the university. Her recently published book, Educaring from the Heart, How to Nurture Your Wellbeing and Rediscover Your Purpose in Education, brings together her experience as a teacher, her research in education and her aspiration for creating change within and across our education systems. Deirdre is also chair of our Path 5 Traveller and Roma advisory group. And finally, we have Professor Martin Myers. Martin is Associate Professor in the School of Education in the University of Nottingham. Martin's research explores the impact of race, racism and social class in different educational contexts, often focusing on Traveller and Roma families, in particular their experiences of education and schooling, relations with non-Traveller Roma neighbours and understandings of mobility. His current research is in the area, concentrates on European policy making and educational inequalities faced by Traveller and Roma people. We very much look forward to hearing your perspectives, and so we'll move on to our first question, and I'm going to ask Ciara to ask that.
Yes, so thanks very much. Maria, we might start over your end first. So the first question is, how can we use policy to make a significant difference for Roma and Traveller students in education to prevent it being a tick box exercise?
Okay, just before I start, you're going to be subject to my handwritten notes, which I can barely read. I have been in your keynote speakers neck of the woods for the last few days, flying in and out of Birmingham, and didn't get home until 2 o'clock this morning, so I can tell you, I'm subjectively not a nice experience. But in terms of some of the policy context, in terms of it, I think there's a couple of key points that I would like to flag in terms of that, and certainly, in terms of. And I suppose I found myself listening to the speakers and, seeing and hearing a lot of what can be reflected across the Irish system as well in terms of racism, and particularly in terms of the systemic racism and how it manifests itself in the everyday lives of travellers and Roma in this country, but also in the institutions and how that's impacting on travellers, and particularly traveller boys and girls in relation to right from early years education through primary, secondary, which is, universities needn't be thinking that it's the point of entry to the university that's where the work starts. They need to be investing and embedding that right in from primary at least onwards. I'm not going to actually go through a whole load of statistics because I know what that can be like, but I do think it's fair to say that travellers fare badly across a whole load of indicators when it comes to, education, accommodation, health, including mental health, and in terms of employment and economic deprivation. One statistic that for me would be really stark, notwithstanding the health statistics that are there that shows, higher infant death mortality rates significantly for traveller mothers and traveller children, but also life expectancy rates and the stark difference that are there. But even also when you look at employment, and in the last census, just over 60% of traveller women were in employment, just over 60% of traveller women were unemployed, So, I mean, compared to, the national average, it's a crisis, but it's not seen by the state as a crisis. When you look at some of those wider statistics in terms of education, and even just from early years, looking at, for white settled Irish, it is over 90% in terms of access, children who transfer into primary from early years. When you break that down for traveller children, it's in the low 70s, and for Roma children, it's even lower in the 60%. So, I mean, right from the get-go, there's a disadvantage. And it's the system that's wrong, not the children and not the families. Just in terms of the policy piece overall, I think it's really important that there's a move from inclusion to anti-racism. I think you need to look at not just access, but actually actively challenging racism within the systems. The importance of co-design with Traveller and Roma, policy with us and not for us. And also in terms of the supporting and resourcing of Traveller and Roma-led organisations to really, who are at the coalface of supporting traveller children in education, supporting their parents. So those kind of resources are really critical in terms of going into that space as well. I think the other bit for me as well is the accountability mechanisms. We need clear targets, we need public reporting, and we need to link funding to outcomes, retention, progression, and completion. And I mean, you've heard about that this morning and the importance of it. It's not just about getting in the door, but it is about, getting through it, and getting through it in a healthy way, and, that doesn't in absolutely every way, because identity is so important as well. And we see the damage that's been done where, travellers, particularly young travellers, have to hide their identity or can totally be invisible in terms of who they are. And when, in public spaces trying to access employment, but also within universities as well. The other 10 points for me, just the other couple of brief points for me in terms of this, is the disaggregated data. It's really important that, the track and Traveller and Roma participation separately, and identifying where students are being lost, and also looking at that from the perspective as well as a gendered piece as well. I went to third level education. I like to tell my brother, who's David's uncle, that I was the first in the family. He was the first in the family, my brother David's father. I probably said that even wrong. No. My brother David was actually, there was 8 of us, and he was the first of 8 of us in our entire direct line of families to go to third level education. I like to tell him that I pipped him at the post when it came to, I was the first to get a degree. He got his degree in law a few months after I got my Bachelor of Arts in Applied Social Studies. So even though he was the first to go, I was the first to get the degree. We move on. I mean, that was the first experience we had of education, and the importance then of that, and when I went, the majority of Traveller women, there wasn't any third level institution, and there was very few of us. It was all mature students. There was probably non-existence of transfer, or I won't say non-existence, but it was probably very low in terms of that traditional route that very many of you in this room have grown up with, your parents have grown up with, in terms of going from primary or from second level into post-primary. And I think that's the really critical target now in terms of that. I'm going to finish just also by saying that representation matters. Hiring Traveller and Roma staff as lecturers, advisors, and including their voices in governance. We've heard a little bit about that this morning as well. I can't say that strongly enough. And I can't say that strongly enough in terms of this is an institution, in terms of third level institutions, but also in terms of primary and post-primary, Traveller teachers. So there is an onus on the universities to be putting in place accessible courses for travellers, in supporting them in every way possible into teaching posts, so that they're in the primary schools, they're in the secondary schools, and they're in the third level institutions. And then finally, I'll just say that long-term commitment, avoid pilot projects that disappear. It's sustainable funding that is key. And we've seen pilot programs, we've seen them come and we've seen them go.
Yeah.
And what we need is long-term sustained funding. I've long argued for the fact that if a Traveller young person survives our early years primary and post-primary education systems, and arrives at the door of a university, it doesn't matter which university is across this country, every door should be open to them, and funding and resources should not be even a consideration as a barrier. They shouldn't even have to think about it. It is an absolute, and I don't mean this as an entitlement, in terms of the damage and the harm that's done through the systemic education system to Traveller and Roma children, and to travellers going back, since the foundation of the state and pre that. It's if they get to the door of it, just open the doors, and whatever is needed, it's put in place by the university. I'll leave it there because I know there's other speakers.
Thank you, Maria.
Thanks so
And to
much,
David.
Maria.
Yeah.
Maria stole my notes. Thanks very much, Maria, and I think she's covered a number of important points. But I was just thinking about the theme of the conference is Call It Out, okay? And I was thinking about policy and the role of policy when it comes to travellers. And actually, when we look across the continuum from accommodation to education to health, all we can define it as is policy implementation deficit. Professor Popal talks a lot about the reality versus rhetoric. The rhetoric is that there's these shiny policies that are in place in universities that talks about the fluffy language of equality, diversity and inclusion. But actually when it comes to the when the push comes to the shove, in terms of access, equality of access, equality of participation and equality of outcomes, they fall deaf on their targets. I was looking at the TRES strategy. The TRES is the Traveller and Roma education strategy. I'm sure I talked to many people in saying it was a pivotal moment for many of us. It's 2006 was the last Traveller and Roma, or Traveller education strategy in the country. And I was reading a report by Pavee Point on the progress of the TRES. 27 actions were meant to be completed by December 25. 7 were done. 7 out of 27. I was involved in the National Access Plan, very parallel to those that they have in the UK, and many of us are familiar with it. There's 5 target groups. It was a momentous moment when Travellers and Roma were named as a priority group within the National Access Plan. They have a target by 2028 of 150 Travellers and Roma in education. I think it's a very modest number by any means or any measure. There was 33 Travellers and Roma. The data is a bit confiscated, but there was 33 in 2021 to 2022. The latest statistics that were put out that there was 40, 23 to 24. 7, an increase of 7. So I think Professor Popal gives a really good insight in terms of the quantitative analysis. We have to look at the data that we have available. And the data that we have available tells us that at a local level, at the university level, at the practice level, these actions are being hampered. Now, I would argue at the centre of all that is a form of racism. Dr. Cindy Joyce talks about assimilation as policy. Anyone's familiar with Travellers, you should be familiar with the 1963 Commission on Itinerancy. We're not going on the history of it. But what she would argue is that actually the assimilation as policy hasn't really changed. Because through the failure to deliver or to fulfil and protect and respect travellers' rights, we're expecting them to assimilate, to internalise the system of oppression that's within our society. So in very brief, what I would say is, Nancy Fraser talks a lot about recognition and redistribution. We have the recognition somewhat in the universities of traveller identity, traveller culture, ethnicity days, beautiful days where we're walking around and we're celebrating. But you can't have diversity without recognising adversity. And that means we have to have a redistribution within our universities, a redistribution of power, a redistribution of rights, a redistribution in terms of knowledge. I sit and I think about different ways of being and doing and knowing. And it's the ethnocentric and settled ways of being, doing and knowing. And I think when Professor Popal was talking about white privilege, I think of settledness. I don't know about other travellers, but the normative framework in Ireland, which is not very different to what white privilege is, but we are always compared and contrasted to the dominant norms and values of settled people. And we are inferiorised based on that. So that's the first thing. The second thing I was going to ask the question I was saying to Calvin before when she walked away was around accountability. What happens when there's a failure to deliver? Traveller accommodation has seen 5 failed accommodation policies over the last 20 years. Education is far from different. What happens? Who is responsible in these universities? We talk about public sector duty. We have to promote equality, prevent discrimination, protect human rights. We have an absolute absence of responsibility or accountability when it comes to travellers. And the last thing I would say, we need a structural change. And Maria kind of talked about it. Disability rights movement talked for a long time when I was in my undergrad. Nothing about us without us. I used to always think, what are they saying? What's that all about? But actually, I would argue there's a lot done on communities, marginalised communities, rather than with them, in a democratic and participatory way. A way where their voices are at the centre of the policies that are there about them. How do you write policies about communities or people when they have no buy-in to them policies? It kind of goes back to what Cameron was talking about at the very start of her lecture, about terminology, about recognition of groups. So they're the 3 things I think we need in terms of policy. And underpinning all of that is not passive inclusion, but an anti-racism. If you're not an anti-racist university, I think the message from today is that you're a racist in a university, and we have to start with that understanding.
Very good.
The worst part of being the third traveller speaker in a row is that it looks like you're just plagiarising what to do. I'll take a kind of slightly different tact, I suppose. I completely agree with what the 2 previous speakers have said. But in terms of how we can use policy as to make a significant difference for Traveller and Roma students in education, and that all has to start, and I'm going to do something apart from what the 2 previous speakers said, but it has to start with acknowledgement. acknowledgement of the issues, the structural, the systemic and the institutional barriers that Travellers and Roma face on a daily basis throughout their life. That it doesn't start at the gate of UCD, it doesn't start at the gate of Trinity College, it doesn't start at the gate of Maynooth University. It starts from the day they go into their creche or their preschool, all the way from their 4 or 5 years of age. That acknowledgement is what they've gotten through. And the other thing to acknowledge as well is that the students that have made it to this point, they're the ones who the education system hasn't completely failed.
Yeah.
It hasn't utterly failed them. It most likely has failed them, but it hasn't utterly failed them. So then when we look at the actual policy then, and the answer to my question earlier on was, there is a disconnect, and I would completely agree with that. When we look at the high level policy that's out there, we have NITRIS, we have I won't speak in acronyms, we have the National Traveller Roma Inclusion Strategy, which has section 7 is the education section, and there is higher education, it's the whole of education. We have the Traveller and Roma Education Strategy. We have the be careful saying this, the NAPR, and the National Action Plan Against Racism. Sounds very similar though to, they didn't think that one through is all I'm going to say. And all of these have actions around education. And then I would say then we have the National Access Plan. And one thing, in terms of that higher level piece that we don't lose sight of, is as the National Access Plan is the dedicated access plan for higher education in Ireland, that Traveller and Roma remain priority within that the TRES does not supersede or take responsibility away from the actions of the university. Now, those higher education plans those higher level policy pieces are straight from the government. There's a whole of government approach to each and every one of them. That does not mean that each individual institution should not have their own individual strategy for how they will implement those high level strategies at a granular level. And that should include action plans, because action plans, this thing with notes, institutional, because action plans signify and demonstrate institutional buy-in. And when I say institutional buy-in here, I'm not a gambling man, but if I was to bet on it here, I'd put my house on that the vast majority of people in this room are, if they're in the university space, are either EDI or Access. And maybe one or two from social policy and social science. But, I'm pretty confident that I'd come out a richer man if I made that bet. But at the same time, what is really needed is whole of institutional buy-in. The core staff outside of EDI, the core staff outside of Access, the core staff outside the social care, and social science. It needs to be the STEM, it needs to be the other subjects. And it goes back into that whole idea that if you're not an anti-racist university, you're a racist university. Because all you're doing then is you're just tailoring the weeds. You're just keeping the weeds down, you're keeping the public face on. And then when we talk about that whole of education approach that the high level strategies do, there's one thing that's hugely missing, and that is the employment piece. Universities, including UCD, but practically every university in the country will love to signify the work they're doing in terms of equality, the work that they're doing for Traveller and Roma inclusion in the college. But what happens afterwards?
Yeah.
What happens afterwards? How little, even when Travellers and Roma, one or two things happens. Either they get a job nowhere near related to their field, and usually end up back in community development. And I mean, they could be a bloody structural engineer, but they're still working a community development job. Or they're working in a job where they are encouraged, either by choice or through just, because it's not conducive to a successful career, to hide their identity in the professional field. And I actually do feel that universities, as the creators of future employers, of employees, and with their deep relationships with a lot of employers in this country, have to take more responsibility in terms of their graduates' post-graduation care, in terms of what happens to their graduate. Because when you look at the league numbers, there's always that thing of, we have so many, all of our graduates in this field, we have so many graduates employed after 2 or 3 years. But do that in terms of that segregated data piece for Travellers and Roma, and you will find that they're not working or they're not identifying. But that goes back as well in terms of any policy has to be rooted in comfort and safety of the student. It has to be student first. And Professor Hopal did say something earlier on about that low expectations piece. But low expectations absolutely do exist. But there has to be that idea that the institution itself has to take responsibility. Because when you talk about low expectations, that's still putting the blame back onto the student. I'm not necessarily saying that the low expectations are, we know that it's the teaching staff that have low expectations, but I'm saying is like, but that's, as a representative of the institution, the teaching staff is putting the blame back onto the student as to why they're failing. When we know that there's so many extra barriers. But when I talk about being rooted in comfort and safety, what I mean is that graduates can come out the far side identifying as travellers. Graduates come out the far side identifying as Roma. I remember when we did the community needs analysis piece on Traveller and Roma higher education, we did it through a photo voice methodology, and one of the pictures was literally a barrier. But you know, one of the barriers where you can't get a van through. Yeah. So you can walk through the barrier. Travellers know what, travellers and Roma, but particularly travellers know what a barrier is because it's on practically every halting site in the country. You'll find one. But above the barrier, there was a band sign, caravan, and I just thought that picture really summed up that idea that you can enter here, but you have to leave a part of you behind you. You have to become acceptable. So in many ways, that assimilist policy of the past has been created with the same assimilist policy dressed up in language of inclusion. So when we go talk about that importance of identifying piece, like, I don't like the idea of role models, I'm not going to lie. I think it puts undue and unfair pressure on individuals, and individuals they're human and they have flaws, but you know, it could lead to a thing, but there can still be examples. I was at the Commission of Man Symposium yesterday, and you know, you were talking about representation in media, all through all forms of media, and I just thought about my own daughter. You know, she will never see herself on TV as a doctor. She will never see herself on TV as a solicitor, as a barrister. She will always see herself as a crook or a lovable rogue, if she's a positive character. That's how she will see herself as a traveller, throughout all of our media. There are traveller barristers. She can't point to one of those. There are traveller doctors. She can't see herself in those because they don't identify. They don't identify. They don't say who they are because it's not conducive to their career. Or that's one reason. Or the other reason is that they have internalized the racism through their time. I would say it intensifies in higher education. And you know, that idea of white privilege came up earlier on. That's one form of white privilege that travellers do have, is that if they do choose to not identify as travellers, that they can hide, they can disappear into the main, and they can be, you know, they can lie to themselves as who they are. But again, the research has shown that this causes damage in the long run. And then that goes back into the work piece about talent. Sorry, I'm rambling on now. But in terms of policy, like I said, policy at the high level is absolutely important, but the granular level is just as important. The granular level, and that means actual, tangible, actionable supports, scaffolding. And if that means targeted actions, or I'm not saying special treatment, but acknowledgement, it goes back to that acknowledgement piece of actions that we do know. I hate this term, the hardest to reach in education. No one's hard to reach. No one's hard to reach if you use the right channels to reach them. But you know, go back to this, you have to see it to be it. But having that, sorry, one more minute. But having that piece of where, you know, meeting people where they're at. That's the catchphrase I'm looking for. That's flying around the pump. Meeting people where they're at. That means taking tangible actions in terms of access programs. Like, you know, a lot of travellers do get married early. I don't agree with the practice. I don't think it's part of a culture. I think it's a practice. But it's acknowledging that, and then creating opportunities that you don't have to wait for mature students before you're 23 before you can access that path. And the last thing I would say then is just on when policy works. You know, the first Traveller and Roma education strategy is this one. The last one, 2006, was proposed. It never came to be. But there was a Traveller and Roma higher education. There was a Traveller specific higher education plan that went with the last National Access Plan, and the last year of that was 2021. And the last year of that plan saw the highest number of Traveller new entrants at that time, which was 50. Pat 5 has finished its first 3-year cycle this year. And the numbers, I'm glad to say, have jumped from 40, as David said, but 24-25, the numbers have jumped to 57. Now, that is nowhere near the target of 150, but that target is still important to keep it ambitious because it creates accountability, it creates momentum. But it's also up from the baseline, which was the first year of COVID, of 33. So it has effectively doubled in the space of 3 years due to Pat 5 funding. And that is why ambitious targets are important. Sorry, I rambled.
You know, when I sit on a panel like this as a white, privileged woman academic, my role I see, and I always see it in the work that I do, is as an ally or somebody to, in some way, give space to voice. So I'm glad you took the time, David. Your voice is more important. Symbolically violent. Calvant, you used that term earlier, and I think we've just heard an account of how symbolically violent our education system is to Traveller and Roma and minoritised groups. And I think we talk about institutions as if they are buildings, but institutions are people. So we in this room, we're the institution. So we have the power to do something, and I know we're going to be thinking about that. But we all have, there's hope in the messages that we are receiving today, in that we can all do something about this. And I think policy, while it is absolutely critical, while we also need it in terms of ensuring we have accountability for what we do, we all play a role in putting that policy into practice. So it's all well and good to have a policy, but it is us, the people, the humanity, that put it into practice. So for me, I think when we think about policy, it's very easy for us to think of it as something up on a shelf, but actually it should be a living, co-created document that shapes the practices that we do in education. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that happens. I was looking at the intercultural guidelines for primary and post-primary education, and they are now 20 years old. And we have outdated policies shaping what happens in our classrooms. And Maria is absolutely right. This work has to start from the minute a child enters into the education system. That's when it starts in terms of the pathway into higher education. I think being silent or not having, or being absent in not having a policy or a clear policy around what we do absolutely is symbolically violent as well. So I think the work that we're doing around the Path 5 Traveller and Roma advisory group, and I see we have people here in the room who are involved in that, in the co-creation actually of the workshop Time to Act, which has been rolled out in UCD, in TCD and RCSI, is a way of us putting policy into practice, to learn, to challenge ourselves, to face uncomfortable ideas we might have or biases that we have, and address them, and in a way be brave in that. And then I see as well colleagues from the National Arts and Education over in the corner over there, who are rolling out the STAR initiative, which supports Traveller and Roma young people in education. But again, you know, that point, Maria, you made around sustaining support, that's so key. It's brilliant to see these initiatives make a change, but if we don't sustain that in terms of financing the policy, how can we expect meaningful change? But I think as an ally, as a friend, as somebody who walks alongside, I very much see my role as somebody to try and take an action, to put policy into practice and to support our friends from the Traveller and Roma communities.
I think I should preface this, but I'm a very gloomy, pessimistic sociologist who does a lot of policy analysis, and my analysis is usually of policies don't deliver what they're intended to do. They tend to reproduce the same outcomes, that exist, particularly in education, so the same sort of poor outcomes get reproduced over and over for long periods of time. And I also used to be, in a previous life, I was a policy advisor, and I was a gloomy, pessimistic policy advisor. So that's where I'm coming from. The question about policy really interests me out because so I'm talking very much to the British education and British experience. There was one piece of legislation that made a huge difference to the outcomes for gypsy traveller children from the UK. And it's often missed, one because it's old, it's go back to like the late 1960s, and you had the Plowden Report. And the Plowden Report did two things very particularly. The report itself was looking at the experiences of children across the whole of primary education. But it had a whole chapter on gypsy families, gypsy children, and it made 2 points. And the first point was that they were the most excluded group of children. And the second was that, so it makes 3 important points. First, that they were the most excluded group within British education. The second was that the key reason for that was the racism that they experienced if they tried to access schools. And the final point was that there was a great desire for education among families and children. So when Plowden came out, the numbers of children attending school was about 1 or 2%. The consequences of Plowden, in particular in sort of policy terms, it led to the creation of Traveller Education Services, who were practitioners who worked directly with families, with schools. They made links between schools and families. They overcome all the other problems. So things they were tasked with addressing issues around health and housing that families were experiencing. And what you sort of saw up until the 1980s was an increase in the number of children going to school. So around the 1980s, it's about 60, 70% of children. So it's a huge success in that sense. And then it plateaus. The sort of brutal truth is that sort of post-2010 travel education services were disbanded. And we're thinking about higher education now, and I look at that, and I can't imagine a piece of policy that would tackle any form of racism, exclusion, marginalisation in education as overtly as Plowden sort of laid it out. Now, that sort of leads me to think, no, so what do you do about policy now? And when I look at the way I would want to influence policy, I can only look at it in a far less, not as a big idea, not as a big structural point, and that reflects changes in politics from over certainly the last 10, 15, 20 years. There's a very different narrative, and I think that sort of leads me, and this is where my gloom and all that comes back into play. The policies, the way of influencing policy tends to be on a much sort of smaller scale. So I was mentioning the GTRSB pledge earlier on. I don't think that's the answer, but it has a small impact. And if I think about changing policy, it tends to come from small activist, community-led pressure on individual institutions, individual schools, and so on. I don't think that's the answer, but that's pragmatically the only bits of change I sort of see in the UK at the moment as having an impact. But that idea of Plowden, I think it's been forgotten that actually you can have a big idea and it can change things really dramatically, but it sort of relies on an absolute just barefaced honesty, just saying, this is the situation, it's awful, and we can do something about it, we will do something about it, we'll put measures in place. I don't see any political group in the UK going down that path at the moment, but it's in the back of my mind, it's always there. So that's my pessimistic view.
Thank you. Okay, so our second question, and I'm just a little conscious of time, it was around what real changes might this include in the classroom or work or the lecture hall, in practice or pedagogy? So we might ask each person for one change that you would like to see happening. And David, I'm going to ask you to start. So one change you'd like to see happening after today.
I don't know if people's familiar with bell hooks or Paulo Freire, but if you're not, I would say they're probably two key people in terms of pedagogy, teaching, because teaching's a relatively new thing to me because I was a social care worker by trade. Get a lot more respect as a lecturer, but I find that amazing. We talk about capital, we're talking about social capital and movement. I was a social care worker, I was working with children, front line, 3 children who are in care, loads of different issues and challenges. And then I say to people, I'm a lecturer, and they go, wow, you're really, really important. And they say, I'm a traveller lecturer, and then they go, oh, yeah. Bell Hooks talks about the classroom as probably one of the most radical sites of possibility in the university. It can either liberate or oppress. And Callan said this morning as well, in terms of education is never neutral, and Paulo Freire would have said very similar about education. He says it can either give you liberation or freedom or conformity. And I would read a lot about and find a lot of comfort in theorising from Indigenous scholars from across the globe. And Linda Twally-Smith writes, the first thing that we have to do is in education is to learn to unlearn. Okay, so that's what I'm going to ask everyone to do, to learn to unlearn. To unlearn the ways of knowing, being and doing, either in policy, either in practice, or either in pedagogy. In terms of how we be within the classroom, because there's a lot of talk about decolonisation. I'm going to finish after this point. And I was in a meeting very recently, and they says we need to change our reading list. And I says, you've missed the whole point. That's not what it's about. You know, it's a very reductive view of decolonisation. So that's my +1.
Great.
To learn to unlearn in terms of power, racism, anti-racism, and so on within our universities.
Brilliant, that's great. Thank you. Maria? Your one change you'd like to see happening?
And I know you want me to be brief, and I will be, I promise. But I do just want to say, before I say my key point, I do want to say that the point that I think was made earlier, and I think was made by David here, in relation to the assimilation policies, right from the 60s, 70s onwards, and even prior to that, those assimilation policies was about segregation. So there's a history of segregation in the classroom right from, early years right through. And I think, that does need to be acknowledged in terms of how we need to try and move forward with that, because that history of segregation and assimilation, while supposedly, in the past, it is still a very contemporary approach to how traveller children are treated. And, when the National Traveller and Roma education strategy was being developed, there was a comprehensive consultation process done across the country, and many of the women, many traveller women participated in those regional consultations, and their own experience and that of their children was incredibly a negative outcome in terms of their experience in education. What we need to see in terms of a change going forward in the classrooms is the need to ensure that the curricula does represent and include Traveller and Roma history and contributions, that it challenges bias in teaching. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and fundamentally underpins systemic racism underpins that. And it shouldn't be an optional piece that you do anti-racism training. It should be core to the whole piece and the importance of that. And fundamentally education is about putting out well-rounded young people into the world. The well-rounded and positiveness, by and large, is knocked out of traveller children with the education system in Ireland, and there needs to be radical change in terms of addressing that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm going to jump. Maria, Deirdre, your one change.
Maria, you robbed me idea. But I think it's key that anybody working in education from early years right up into higher education engages in anti-racism training and becomes aware and gets uncomfortable with their own biases that they hold and addresses them. So I absolutely agree with that. And the other thing, the second thing I want to say is the theme of this symposium, call it out.
Yeah.
I was in a situation 2 weeks ago in a room with policymakers, and I had to call them out because of an assumption that they made about travellers. And it was uncomfortable, and I might never get invited into a room like that again. But if we don't call it out, it just keeps happening. And if you're in a space, and we are when we're working in a university, we're in spaces of power and privilege, and we will be protected if we do call it out. We hope we keep our job. But just do it, call it out. And I think that's a really important role that we play.
Brilliant.
Can I
Great.
just add to Deirdre's point?
Yeah.
Just very briefly add to your point. Making anti-racism everyone's responsibility, not just the people affected by it. And I think that point you're making in terms of calling it out, it is everybody's responsibility and not just those affected.
See the word bias. I think we should get rid of the word bias. I think we've really referred back to this. I sit in meetings all the time, and when my students go out into placement and they're going unconscious bias, Prince Harry popularised that term. That term was popularised when Prince Harry wrote about the racism within the royal family. I don't know if it's good enough to say that we're unconsciously biased. We're conscious. If you look at the psychology of racial discrimination, stereotypes is your thoughts, prejudice is the feelings and the thoughts, and discrimination is the actions. Bias is a cognitive phenomenon that we've kind of pulled upon to somewhat alleviate the responsibility around racism. Maybe that's another plus one. Just listening to the lot. I was kind of getting irked to say I have to say it.
It's okay. Martin, if you want to say your one action.
Yeah, everything's been stolen, hasn't it? I'll pick up, David said something about types of knowledge that are produced, and that always interests me. In UK universities, in terms of what we teach students, particularly in sort of social sciences, is around the idea of being critical, of criticality. One of the things I try to do with my students, which I teach across a range of modules that are usually around education or educational sociology, is to be critical of the institution itself. One of the things I will teach is the attainment gap, and that's like a really big thing that I teach. There's an attainment gap in my own university. It's existed forever. And it's something that's always acknowledged by the university, but it doesn't change. And I find sort of getting my students to actually delve into what's going on around them in their own educational space, that it opens eyes, and it's a form of criticality that isn't the sort of criticality that's envisaged by the university itself. So that would be my approach.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you. And David?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief this time. Third traveller to go again, yeah. I know a lot of the stuff has been said. So I think the only thing I could really add to it then would be more on the curriculum design. Rather than the pedagogy itself, because pedagogy comes from curriculum design. But we always talk about inclusion, and I would actually change that word from inclusion to representation. And I mean this for all minoritized groups, not just Travellers and Roma. And representation doesn't mean, if we're talking about the laws of science, we make culturally appropriate for other minority groups. It means that where it's appropriate, be appropriate. And even as part, I liked your point there about decolonisation, David. Like if we take a very brief example of that, if you take John B, if you're doing Irish Lit in English and you're doing John B. Keane's The Field, the representation of travellers in that book, in that play, is absolutely atrocious. It's still a masterpiece of a play in terms of Irish literature. You can still critically analyse race relations through that kind of, if you take a CRT lens or whatever, in that sense. So it doesn't mean absolutely wiping out the past or wiping out cultural heritage. It just means looking at it through a new lens, looking at it through a new kind of vision, and seeing what's the impact of that. So yeah, that kind of representation piece, understanding that Travellers and Roma, and this is, you see this large part with the cultural days, and I've seen this across the sector, that we're not just our heritage, we're not just the wagon and the tin spitting and everything that we came from. We're still a contemporary modern people that is outputting culture and literature and making these contributions that can be studied and can be brought into curricula. And we are still, along with the rest of Irish society, creating history and creating material for study.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you. Okay.
Fiona, can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
Go.
Just one example of that. I teach, I'm very fortunate and privileged, and I think that's another thing. And Maria was talking about segregated educational provision. I went to a travel-only preschool and creche until I was 6. Now, hopefully you're looking at me thinking I'm not that old. You know? But just in terms, segregation didn't stop to 2006. But a good example of around modules and around traveller studies and knowledge and ways of being, as Martin and David and others have touched on. UCD was the first to design a traveller ethnicity and rights module. It was done by Dr. Hannah McGinley and Dr. Cindy Joyce. And I was very fortunate to be asked to teach it then, and I've been teaching it for the last 3 to 4 years. Cindy done the same in UL Limerick. And I think a +1 would be if you're in a university, no majority here are probably from UCD, but wouldn't it not be a consideration that there would be a module there? You know, we talk about the mandate of anti-racism, and Dr. Thomas McCann would always talk about, you know, traveller studies. We have black studies, we have English studies, Irish studies, you know, and across Europe there's a far more stronger scholarship in terms of Roma as a broader collective. But just to name that module, because it's very successful and it does a lot of great work, not just for the students that attend, but more broadly in terms of the representation and the value of traveller knowledge systems.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you very much. So we will draw our panel discussions to a close. I just ask you to thank our panellists again, Maria Joyce, David Friel, David Joyce, Deirdre McGillicuddy and Martin Myers.
Good, thank you so much. I'll take that off you then.
So